Let's take a nostalgic look back at AM radio and talk about what happened. I also want to talk about the General Electric Super Radio. And finally, I'd like to tell you about a discovery that I made, which was the source of a major amount of radio interference around the house that I would not have expected or anticipated. AM radio is kind of special to me. A lot of memories there. Memories of driving across the country late at night, in the middle of the night, turning on the radio and tuning across the band to find a station out of the noise, and picking up maybe Art Bell and listening to him talk about UFOs and conspiracies, or tuning the station and picking up a sports game from Philadelphia, or a news broadcast. And you could hear stations from all over the country. And it was a glimpse into another world. It was pretty fascinating. And it was one of those things where you never knew what you were going to find. You had to do a little digging. Sometimes you found something really good. Sometimes I would turn on the AM radio at night, and if the conditions were just right, you could pick up stations from far, far away, like Puerto Rico or Chicago. Sometimes from North Carolina, I would tune around and try to pick up those stations in Dallas, Texas, which was my former hometown. And I could listen to the stations that I used to listen to when I was in that region. And it brought me back. It's a pretty special time. And I think it's pretty interesting and fascinating to be able to pick up stations from so far away and get a little glimpse into what's happening on the other side of the world. Those were interesting times, and you can still do that today, but not quite to the same degree. AM radio these days, not quite as vibrant as it once was. Back in those days, we had a lot less choice of media. Back then, when we talked about broadcast media, it was radio or TV. And a major market would have a few big TV stations and a handful of radio stations. Small towns all across the nation would have their own little radio station. And most of them were completely independently owned and operated. A lot of them gave the DJs quite a bit of latitude as to what they wanted to play. So there was a lot of variety. A lot of wild and wacky stuff could be caught on the radio back in those days. But as time moved forward, so did the culture. And there was a lot of consolidation. A lot of these stations started getting bought up by large parent companies that unified the programming. And so there's a lot less variety, a lot less interesting off-the-wall stuff happening, and became a little less interesting to listen to. And also we have a whole lot more media choices now, of course. We have cable and satellite TV with hundreds of channels of high-quality programs to choose from. We have the internet, and you're watching this video right now rather than listening to the radio. And so with the rise of competition, with fewer people listening to AM radio, the budgets at AM stations declined, and that made it even more difficult to promote them, put on really high-quality content, and retain listenership. Now, of course, you can still listen to AM radio, and you can still pick up stations far, far away. But it's not quite as easy these days because we've become a digital world. Back in the 1970s and before, we were pretty much an analog world, and we didn't have the sources of noise pollution that we do now. Now we have computers. We carry around phones, and almost all kinds of equipment have digital switching power supplies in them. And so with all of this electronic processing and switching at very high rates of speed, those switching events cause electronic transients to happen, and the equipment emits radio frequency energy and harmonics that are generated from that switching activity. And that switching noise and its harmonics can extend well into the radio band. And so if you take an AM radio and you put it next to your cell phone, next to your desktop computer, or next to a lot of different pieces of equipment that are commonplace today, you'll hear a buzzing, cracking sound, which is the radio emissions coming from that equipment. And even if the equipment isn't putting off that much spurious background radio noise, well, every little bit adds to the electronic smog. And so now, if you're in a big city and you're surrounded by thousands and thousands of electronic devices around you, all of which are doing computerized type processes or having switching power supplies and creating a bit of electrical noise, it creates a baseline of electrical noise fog over the radio bands. And it's increasingly difficult to pluck out those extremely weak, faraway radio stations and sniff them out through that haze and fog of background radio noise that is so pervasive in our world today. And so it's made long-distance radio listening more difficult. And all of these factors have coalesced to make that hobby not quite as popular as it once was. But all is not lost. In many areas, you can step away from a lot of that noise pollution, and you can still pick up long-distance radio if the atmospheric conditions are right. Where I'm at, there's not a whole lot of radio stations nearby and not a whole lot of industry nearby, and so it should be a pretty favorable environment for listening to long-distance radio. And long-distance radio is a need because when I did a scan of the area that I'm in, we have one or two fairly close by AM radio stations. It's, in our region here. But beyond that, the next closest station is over 100 miles away. Well, I was feeling a little bit nostalgic about my old days of sitting, listening late at night to all sorts of different programs in the AM radio and being able to, explore the world a little bit through the eyes of a local radio station in a town far, far away. And that nostalgia made me think, I should see if I can get myself a decent AM radio, see if I can pick up any signals out here. And also, knowing that there aren't very many nearby AM radio stations where I'm at, I thought I should get a good quality radio if I'm going to have any chance of picking up hardly anything at all. And then another thing that occurred to me that made me think maybe it would be a good idea to have a good quality portable radio that's battery operated is the recent storms that have happened this springtime. We've had an incredible amount of very powerful storms that have moved through the country this spring. And maybe it's not that unusual, but I was watching for a couple of days a group of storms moving across the country that were spawning mini tornadoes. And it occurred to me that if there's a terrible weather event or some kind of emergency, and you find yourself holed up trying to take shelter from the storm, it's nice to have a radio so you can keep in touch with what's happening in the outside world. Hear local broadcasts from the local station telling you whether or not there's more storms coming or if all is clear. And so I started looking at my choices in portable radios, and there's a lot of good radios out there. C. Crane is a big name in this business, and they have some great choices. And one of the radios that caught my eye was the GE Super Radio. This is an old radio. GE put out the Super Radio starting in 1979, and that product continued on till about 2008. So those radios are 30, 40 years old now, but it was a good product. And many of those radios are still working fine today, which is a testimony to the quality of that product. And the GE Super Radio has achieved just a little bit of a cult status. It's considered pretty desirable by a lot of people. But fortunately, they're still readily available on eBay if you're looking for one. And on eBay, a good quality super radio that's in pretty decent condition will sell for a little more than its original retail price. But for $100 and less, you can find plenty of them for sale, or at least at the time I looked. Now, a brand new one, never used, that's been sitting in a box for 40 years and is in pristine condition, well, those are kind of collectible and they can fetch a pretty good amount of money. But for a working example that isn't too bad, it's pretty affordable generally. And the GE Super Radio just was a really good product. And so let's talk about what's so super about the Super Radio. This is the GE Super Radio. This is the original GE Super Radio. And I got this one for a very good price. The reason being is that it's in quite good condition overall, but it had a broken antenna. And of course, the original parts for this are long gone and not available, so this is not an original antenna. It's just a typical whip antenna that I grabbed and I soldered onto the radio. Now, the GE Super Radio is not a particularly feature-filled radio. It doesn't have shortwave bands. It's mono. It's not stereo. It was just intended to be a decent radio for use out in your shop so you can listen to the sports game or the news or local music, maybe a little background music in your store. Just a typical AM, FM portable radio. No real exotic features. It doesn't have digital memory preset tuning or anything like that. So what's so super about it? Well, a few things. One is that it can be powered off of 6 D-cell batteries, or you can plug it into the wall. And it has super lifetime on batteries. Some users have claimed 200 hours, 400 hours of battery lifetime. And so with that kind of lifetime on a set of batteries, I think that makes this a pretty good radio to have down in your basement when you're trying to take shelter from the storm. So if you should lose power for an extended period of time, well, the radio will probably last for a long time and keep you connected to the local news. Another thing that's super about the Super Radio is that it has super good sound. It doesn't have really hi-fi sound, and that wasn't their target audience. They're not trying to replace a hi-fi system with this, but it does have better than average sound for a portable radio. It's got a larger than average speaker and a better than average speaker, so it's a pretty easy radio to listen to. It doesn't sound tinny or harsh or constricted. It's got good quality audio. For what it is, for an inexpensive portable radio, sounds pretty good. The thing that really sets this radio apart is its performance, and it has super performance. It's just a good radio and a great design. The FM section in this radio is pretty good, but it's not spectacular. But the AM reception of this radio is spectacular. It's outstanding. And the reasons for that is because in the circuitry of the radio, there are more filter stages than most other radios. So it can suss out and pick out those AM signals out of the noise that a lot of other radios have trouble with. And the other thing that really sets it apart in AM performance is that on the back here inside the radio, it has an internal antenna. And the internal antenna in this radio is much larger than most radios like this. It is a huge internal AM antenna, which allows it to really capture weak signals and allow you to listen to stations that would be a challenge on many other radios. The radio also has terminals in the back where you can attach an external antenna if you're so inclined. So the Super Radio is a super radio largely because of its super performance. And it's pretty impressive. Now, GE came out with a few different variations of this radio. This is the original Super Radio. A while later, they came down with the Super Radio 2. And the Super Radio 2 looks almost identical to this one. Now, there are some very minor cosmetic changes, like the colors of the knobs change. But other than that, they look almost identical side by side. And to the untrained eye, they might not be able to notice the difference at first glance. The big change with the Super Radio 2 is that the speaker system includes a tweeter in the Super Radio 2. And that doesn't really make much impact when listening to AM stations. But for FM, the additional tweeter can add just a little bit of extra sparkle to it. I think the Super Radio 1 sounds fine, but the Super Radio 2 has maybe just a little tiny bit better sound quality because of the addition of the tweeter. Now, some people have reported that different production runs of the Super Radio 2 had different levels of tweeter output, and some of them sounded great. And I have, in addition to this radio, a Super Radio 2, and its tweeter sounds fine to me. But some people have reported that some of the tweeters were excessively bright. And because of that, they say, actually, the Super Radio 1 is a better choice. Then, the next version was the Super Radio 3, which was a pretty significant redesign. The case looks different from that, and the radio circuitry has had some pretty significant changes as well. The Super Radio 3 is a great radio, and some folks say that it has better sound quality than the Super Radio 1s and 2s. However, the radio circuitry isn't quite as sensitive as the earlier versions. So the Super Radio 3 is a good radio, both AM and FM, but it's not a spectacular radio like the really old ones are. The Super Radio 1, the Super Radio 2, internally, their circuitry is very, very similar. Hardly any changes. And likewise, performance-wise, there's hardly any difference. They're just about identical in performance. And I would speculate that any differences in performance from the Super Radio original to the Super Radio 2 probably has to do with just the component values drifting over time, or how carefully the radio was tuned up and tweaked in and calibrated. So both the Super Radio and the Super Radio 2 are really fantastic radios, especially in terms of AM performance. And these radios are considered probably in the top 3 or top 5 radios of this style, portable radios, of all time for AM radio performance. There are, of course, some other radios that are equally good or maybe better than the GE Super Radio, but you'll probably end up paying a lot more money for those. So I picked up the Super Radio, and it works really well. I was impressed by how many AM signals I was able to pick up at night. After I took care of this interference problem at my house, which I'll tell you about in a minute, shockingly, I was able to turn on the radio, and it seemed like every time I moved the tuning dial just a little bit, I'd pick up another AM station. Most of them pretty weak down in the noise, but they were there. And many were loud and clear. And so I can't tell you the number. It was a large number. I was just hitting station after station as I tune across the dial. And I know that the closest station to me is over 100 miles away. So I was able to pick up all kinds of stuff. Now, of course, that varies night to night depending upon the atmospheric conditions. Some nights are really good and you can pick up all kinds of stuff, and other nights, well, a little more challenging. But I was very impressed. But before I had that experience, I would turn on the radio and I would get a lot of noise. Now, pure noise, natural noise, would sound like pink noise or white noise, just a random hissing type of background sound. But that wasn't what I was picking up, and that's probably not the kind of noise that most of us are going to pick up these days. What I was picking up was a raspy buzzing sound, or a rhythmic clicking, buzzing tone sound. And when you hear that, you know that that is man-made noise from electrical equipment putting out radio frequency pollution. Now, as I mentioned, we're living in a whole sea of digital equipment these days, and it seems like there are many, many things around us that are producers of radio noise, from the desktop computer to video displays, digital clocks, your battery charger, your phones, of course. All kinds of equipment can put out digital noise. Almost any kind of equipment that uses a switching power supply, like your hi-fi systems, and just so many things just create noise. Being out where I am, I didn't expect to be flooded with artificial radio frequency noise. And things are pretty quiet in the house. I didn't have many appliances or anything turned on. So I turn on the radio and I'm hearing this terrible buzzing sound. I thought, I'm going to just start going around the house, and fortunately, since the radio is battery powered and portable, I can just carry it around with me. As I unplug basically everything that is plugged into the wall outlets from one room to another, and see what that does to the noise profile that I'm hearing. And oftentimes when I'd unplug some appliance or some piece of equipment, I would hear the noise change and get a little bit quieter. You know, all these pieces of equipment contribute to the noise floor, and so I could unplug different things and hear the noise get just a little better, but I still had an extremely powerful, raspy noise situation happening. And let me show you what I discovered was the source of noise that was just wiping out radio signals all throughout the house. Sounded like that. Wow. So, we remove this light bulb, and this is just an inexpensive LED light bulb. I've got a whole bunch of these around the house, all supposedly identical. So I grab another one, identical to the one I pulled out, same manufacturer, think I bought them at the same store at the same time. Right?
The goalie who revolutionized hockey, the bravery of Lucille Ball,
And get a great big bottle of vitamin vitamin tomorrow.
and Larry David.
My problem was a bad LED bulb. And like I mentioned, I got lots of these. They're identical to each other, but this one here is putting out a whole bunch of radio noise. And it's possible that LED bulbs put out noise, obviously, but it wouldn't be the first thing that I was targeting. My first thought was it was probably some kind of computer device or something with a complicated switching power supply. I didn't expect that it would be coming from a simple LED bulb. But I went around the house and started turning off everything one at a time until the noise went away. This was the culprit. And this bulb was on the other side of the house, wiping out radio reception all throughout the area. So it's putting out a lot of RF spurious energy. But I think the bottom line is, if you're getting a lot of radio frequency noise and you're looking for the source, don't overlook anything. It could be almost anything these days that is generating that kind of electrical noise. And in my case, it was one of these simple, inexpensive LED bulbs. This is a bad bulb. Although it illuminates, it looks like it's a good bulb, but it's obviously got a problem. So I hope that was interesting to you. And if it was, and you like this kind of content, hey, I'd appreciate it if you give the video a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like. Thanks for tuning in.